Should public sector workers be given bigger pay rises? Let's just have a look at the situation as it currently stands. Now, Rachel Reeves offered a 2.8% boost for people like teachers, nurses and the police back in December. But the Trade Union Congress is warning she could face demands for even more. There she is, Rachel. Hopefully her CV is in order. Now, see, when the offer was made, inflation was only forecast to be 2.6% for the coming year, which, you know, on the face of it, looks like a reasonable offer in line with inflation. But now the Bank of England expects it to be higher, maybe as much as 3.7%. And to make it worse, our economy is barely growing. Let's have a look at this number. Rather chilling, right? So last year, Rachel Reeves made putting an end to the strikes one of the first things she did, agreeing to rises which were above inflation. The average pay rise was 5.5%. That was last year. So I'm going to ask you, last year, Nina, it was 5.5%. Here, 2.8% might not meet inflation. Is she doing the right thing?
Well, the thing is, we're in a terrible situation with the public sector workers. Let's define who they are. That's doctors, nurses, teachers. And we have an enormous problem with firstly, we don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. I think we're missing about 32,000 nurses. Mm-hmm. But we come to teachers, which is, you know, it's the most important, one of the most important aspects of our society, our teachers, because it's our young people, it's our future. And the problem is the retention is dreadful. I mean, a third of teachers, trained graduate teachers, leave within 5 years. Right. And there's a huge also proportion who leave within 10 years. And, you know, and why wouldn't you want to go and, say, live in Australia and get far more money and have a happier life?
Well, that's about retention, although that's an important point. A number of people leave for a better life in Australia and other parts of the world to serve their national health services instead of ours, despite us having, understandably, trained them in the first place. Although, let's not forget that lots of our students in a great deal of debt, so it's not exactly free. But, Mike, you know, the other element is somebody people out there will no doubt be arguing. It's about decency. Well, you know, when you're earning 36,000 a year, especially in London, that often doesn't touch the sides if you're a teacher or a nurse. Yeah. And if you can't meet inflation, it means you can't feed yourself. What does that say about our attitude to public sector workers?
Well, I'm sorry. I think public sector pay rises should be frozen until the productivity is caught up. That 5.5%, which was double inflation when they were awarded, remember that, double inflation, came with no strings attached. It didn't just go to public service workers, teachers, doctors and all that. Another huge pay rise went to the train drivers, who, you know, are semi-public service because of the arrangement.
Mike, hang on a second. There'll be people just pause for a second if you don't mind, because there are people at home, right, who'll go into the NHS today and have an encounter. Millions of people every single day. Plus, how can you be more productive as a nurse? Well, what should you do?
Well, what you can do is you can look at the whole structure of the NHS and get rid of the people who don't need to be there, the middle managers, massive numbers of diversity and equality officers who simply, we don't know what they do. I mean, let me give you some figures, for instance. So people in the public sector are looked after brilliantly. If the government had to pay up the public sector pension fund tomorrow, it would be between £3 and £5 trillion. That's how much money they've been given in pensions over the years to which they are entitled. The welfare bill in this country is $280 billion a year.
Wait a second.
That's not
$280 billion.
Go do respond.
But the welfare bill is not there because of working nurses, doctors and teachers. It is there because of the people who are not working, who are...
And I'm saying cut it. I'm saying cut it and save the government money. You don't need to give big rises to the public sector. They're already very well looked after.
They are not. I mean, in real terms, since 2011, their take-home salaries have dropped by 23%.
Well, how
Everybody's
much, how much
23%.
a nurse earns each year, or a police officer, or a teacher, Mike? Give us your best guesstimate.
About 32,000 for a nurse, about 36 for a policeman.
Right, and
Okay.
living in London, for example, do you think you could get very far on that?
Well, look, you're only talking about the public sector. What about the private sector? The private sector are the only parts of our economy that create wealth, which is then taxed and then given to the public sector. So there's a terrible imbalance because the private sector have not had the pay increases that the public sector have had. I'm sorry.
The public sector
and they do not
cannot
get
create-
pensions.
The public sector cannot create wealth by definition. They are
They can create wealth.
Listen, the public sector, teachers, nurses, doctors, police, they are the people who look after us. How on earth can they create growth? They cannot create
Nina,
growth by the definition of what they do.
When you read that local authorities are now very happy for their workers to work a 4-day week for the same amount of money, that is a decrease in productivity. And systems like that have got to turn around. People should be told to go back to their offices in the public sector because it does not work working from home.
Nina.
Fair enough. Okay, work-life balance, and I all understand it. And the pandemic changed everything. I happen to think that it's skewed too far the other way, and that we do need to take work more seriously, and there isn't the same work ethic that there used to be. But that does not apply to teachers. How can that apply to teachers, nurses and doctors? They are working as hard as possible. I mean, all this hypocrisy of us standing banging saucepans in pandemic, and now they're the worst people in the world because they need more money.
I'm asking, because a lot of people don't necessarily know. A lot of our viewers work in the public sector, right? Now, when I said about decency, it's this: you've got to have a rise that meets inflation in order that people can afford goods and services. Just so we know what we're talking about, right? Yeah. People at home should have an idea of this. Thanks very much, a brilliant researcher, because I didn't know either. So cheers out there to Ellie. A nurse averages between 33,000 and 35,000. 2.8% is less than 1,000 a year. That's what she or he will be earning. Police, their starting salary, £38,269. I don't know where that is. I'm going to assume that's weighted according to where you are in the country. 2.8% is just over £1,000. A teacher's starting salary is, well, around £31,650, a bit higher in London. 2.6%, right, is £886. And civil servants, the median, right, so that's the bit in the middle, what the average of a civil servant, not the poshos at the top or the new starters, that's 2.8%, and that's less than £1,000. So we're talking about, right, bearing in mind how much it costs to heat your house, bearing in mind how much food costs, is
Rob,
very little.
I wouldn't mind giving them an increase if they would sack 66,000 civil servants that were taken on during the COVID period, which should have been laid back off again, but which haven't. We all know that the civil service productivity levels are absolutely disgraceful. People working from home, going on a 4-day week, lots of them are
We hear you, right. The answer is all about efficiencies, get rid of the bad people. But let's see, Derek in Northamptonshire. Do you agree with Mike? Well, is it not about pay rises, but getting rid of the dead weight and the shirkers?
Oh, good morning, everybody. Yes, I agree with Mike. The public sector clearly includes a range of different types of employees in different fields of activity. But I would certainly pick out local government, which I believe, along with other public sector workers, got quite a substantial pay increase as soon as the Labour government came into power. And then we hear now that they want to work a 4-day week, as Mike has said, and we also hear that they want to cut services like fewer bin collections.
Well, I hear you, Derek, but the interesting thing is that local government employees, they can negotiate their contracts with local governments, and part of the reason that many of them, I mean local authorities, are, to say the least, in financial shtuck. Many of them, it has to be said, but not across the board, Labour-run local authorities are totally bankrupt. But it's interesting what you have to say. Thanks for calling. Merseyside, Kim. Now, as I understand it, you are one of our great nurses. Do you work in the NHS, Kim?
I do indeed, yes.
Well, firstly, thank you for your service. And I thought not to just to bang pots and pans, once in an epidemic in a blue moon, but to say thank you for your work throughout the year. Let me ask you, what would this 2.8% mean to you? On average, it's about £1,000 a year. Do you think that that's right for you and your colleagues at the hospital you work in?
I don't know. I see a lot of my colleagues that have got children that aren't meeting the ability to feed their children. I see them having to work additional shifts. That takes us away from our families. We as nurses are now in a profession where it's a degree-based profession. And nurses are having to pay.
Kim, the reason I'm interrupting is not because I want you to get off the call. I want people to hear what you have to say. Lots of people have opinions, and it's important they do, but then they get to meet and hear somebody like you. Just to be clear, the first thing you've said is you have nursing colleagues that come to work, they'll come to work today, that are struggling to feed their kids, right? That's the first thing.
Yeah.
And what you're about to tell us is that it's a degree-based profession. So am I right that you get into debt before you've even started being a nurse?
Nowadays, nurses, I was lucky to have a bursary place job. However, nurses now have to pay to start to be a nurse. You know, you're starting on a deficit, and then you want to retain a nurse. Why should a nurse stay in a profession where there's a lot of pressure put on us? We're short-staffed. We're having to care for more patients than
Kim, can I ask you again? It's not me cutting over you. It's just we're on a tight schedule here, and what you have to say really matters. I've got two questions for you. The first one is, how much do you think would be a reasonable pay rise? And the other thing is, you might be listening to what Mike has to say, and to an extent, Nina, I wonder whether some of the managers that you have in the hospital should be given the boot and that money go directly to nurses. What do you think about those two things? What's the correct pay rise? And should some of the middle management go in order to make sure that the other nurses can feed their kids?
I agree with the RCN, a 15% pay rise to take into account the pay freezes that we've been on over the last several years. And middle management, it should be called. And, there's a manager to manage a manager, to manage a manager. We need more nurses on the floor on patient care.
I'm for that.
Absolutely.
Right. I'm going to... can I say, Kim, thank you for calling. Right. It's really... I'm going to use this as a gift to hear from somebody that's at the coalface every day. You've heard what she had to say. I'm going to go to Mike first, and I'll come back to you.
Okay, look, Kim does a very valuable job, and I'm grateful to her as well.
I mean, but nurses saved your life, didn't they?
Yes, of course they did. That's what I pay my taxes for, to put up the National Health Service. But can I tell you, people in the private sector are also working 16 hours a day to feed their children, and they're the people who create the wealth which allows us to have a National Health Service. I don't want them discriminated against just because they don't work for the government or work for the NHS.
The thing is, you read stories of nurses having to go to food banks, and that is outrageous.
Yes, but lots of people go to food banks, Nina.
No, I mean,
lots of people do.
That is
which is not a good thing,
no,
but it's not just for
completely
nurses.
wrong. If you have dedicated your life to helping others, and you've put yourself in debt financially to get the training, and then you do not deserve to have to go to a food bank. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And you can
a doctor.
It might be heartbreaking, but
it happens in every profession.
It is heartbreaking. There's no doubt about it. You listen to a nurse saying that there are people on her shift, right, who are going around doing everything they can, right, to be great nurses, and they can't afford, basic necessities.
Yeah.
But then there is, of course, an economic reality where the state has to determine whether or not they can afford it. 10% of national income, that's 22% of total UK government spending, is spent on public sector employees. That's 5.9 million people in the UK. And I wonder whether you acknowledge what Mike has to say, and Al Nurse, where they agree, is that there's lots of people in the public sector who, frankly, don't need to be there.
I agree with that. And I think also, for instance, the Home Office have done a dreadful job. And we can, you don't want to start talking about immigration, but the lack of efficiency in processing immigrants is just indicative
let's go to
the
Virginia
lack of
in Somerset.
accountability.
Virginia,
in the public
you're in
sector.
Somerset. I wonder whether you agree that, I'm going to put it euphemistically, whether savings could be made by perhaps getting rid of some people.
Absolutely. Good morning. I totally agree with Mike, and I also agree with Nina. But the bottom line is, there is no money. We haven't got any money, and it's no good saying the NHS and they all deserve it, the teachers deserve it. Yes, we all deserve it. And every Joe Soap in this country who works hard deserves more money.
Right,
but the bottom line, if the NHS are going to keep wasting money hand over fist, why don't they employ auxiliary nurses, like they used to to do all the work in the wards.
Well, they
so
spend a
that the
lot of money.
qualified nurses can
Virginia,
do-
they spend a lot of money in auxiliary nurses. They also pay a lot of money, right, for locum doctors every day who get significant uplift because they don't have the doctors in the first place.
Let's go down the GP route.
That's a different thing. I hear you, Virginia,
Well, it's all NHS.
Well, I hear you, but what you're saying is efficiencies can be made, and I think that's a general message. But before we go, I want to go to another public sector work. We focused on the NHS. Let's move to, what in many people's view, certainly mine, is perhaps the most precious job there is out there. Tracy, you're a teacher in London. 2.8%, is that going to make a big or significant impact to your life and other people that are educating our young?
Good morning, everyone. I think a pay rise would be great. And like the lady said before, we don't have the money to do it. But I've been a teacher for 20 years, internationally and in London. And it's not about the money as far as I'm concerned. It's about the workload. You can pay me 50, 70, 100, 150,000 pounds a year. But my terms and conditions aren't going to change. My workload isn't going to change. I'm still going to be at school at 6:37 in the morning, and I'm still going to leave at 6 at night. And as a senior leader, I've had to go around schools getting teachers out because they have to go home to sleep. And there's 3 reasons that teachers leave the profession at the moment are behaviour, parental behaviour and workload.
And what was the other one thing? Sorry, do Karen, sorry? Parental behaviour, what else?
Behaviour of children, parental behaviour. Me and my colleagues have been spat at, kicked, screamed at, abused by parents.
Yeah, talk about people that should go to prison. Carry on. What's the third thing?
The third load is workload. So the government has extended the school day, but we're governed by 1265 hours a year, but that hasn't been taken into account.
So you say, this is a very interesting one. So what you're saying, I think, and as I understand it, and I've a lot of most beloved relatives in my family are teachers, is that it's not just about pay, but it's about the terms and conditions and how teachers and where teachers are forced to work. But if you're going to invite teachers to be there at 6 o'clock in the evening and leave at 10 o'clock at night, do all the lesson prep, etc., you should pay them an adequate, reasonable hourly rate.
I agree, but also that this comes down to have a shortage of teachers. If there were more teachers, then the teachers who are there don't have to be spread so thinly.
Well, the question is, would retention be better, exactly as you were saying at the beginning, if we were to pay them more? Thank you, Mike and Nina, as ever. And thank you, Tracy, for calling in. And thank you for going to school every day and teaching young learners.